This is where we talk about learned helplessness. In 1960s, a psychologist, Martin Seligman, and his colleagues created a large box with a low wall that divided a box into two sections. Each section was a chamber, and they placed a dog in one of the chambers titled the avoidance chamber. This is where the dog would receive an electric shock periodically. As you might assume, the dogs, when reacting first to the shocks, jumped and ran around the chamber trying to escape it. Now, mind you, this shocking method wouldn't pass rigorous ethical standards today, but the dogs learned that they could jump over the wall that divided both chambers, and in doing so would allow them to escape the shock. The dogs also learned that when the tone was presented, or when a tone was presented before the shock, that would signal the shock was coming. It acted as a conditioned stimulus, to which they would jump over the wall to avoid the shock altogether. But what these researchers did was to see what would happen if shocks were delivered to the animals and they could not escape. They could not jump over the wall and avoid that shock. This was in the first phase of the experiment. But then after that, when the wall was lowered where they could escape, they learned, or the behavior changed, in other words, to be helpless even when there was a way to escape. Researchers found that with this prior exposure to an inescapable shock had taught the animals that they were helpless, and the dogs learned that they could not avoid it in this first phase, and just laid there in the second phase, even though they could physically avoid the shock. This is what's called learned helplessness. What is meant by this is that exposure to an uncontrollable punisher teaches one to expect that any responses are useless. Another real-life example in animals you may see comes from how some trainers in India tie them up to a stake by one of their legs. As babies, these elephants cannot escape because they aren't big enough or strong enough. They become helpless. This later affects them once they get large enough to escape, to easily escape, but they have already learned helplessness. Even when their conditions have changed, and even though they have become large and can get away, they think it will not lead to a new consequence, getting free. Seligman noting that like other things, such as fear and unhappiness, that it can be learned, so can happiness and hope, he believes. Seligman tells us that depression and its effects can be acquired through learned helplessness as well. He knows people who are depressed often sit around not motivated doing much, skip work or school, etc. Because according to Seligman, they feel unable to do anything to change their condition. They feel hopeless. They sit like his dogs and endure the pain without trying new ways to avoid or escape it. To support his claim, he notes that when you look at individuals who take antidepressant drugs, you can find that sometimes it alleviates the depression within humans, and it can make them regain some of that motivation they had once lost. Also, when antidepressant medication was used in rats and that were exposed to an inescapable shock, researchers found that they recovered their motivation to escape. But perhaps we do not need that medication, Seligman notes, because he found that when he first trained animals to escape the shock, then exposed them to an inescapable shock, then tested them once more in a phase where the animals could escape that shock, they responded to the shock by escaping it. But could the same principle really be applied to humans? This tells us that initial successes with overcoming difficulty or overcoming a small challenge initially may help immunize us against learned helplessness, especially with humans in these situations. So what this might mean is that perhaps, like we have discussed before, that being exposed to adversities early in life that we can overcome, or minor stressors that we can overcome, may protect us in the future from learned helplessness when we encounter some inescapable shock, so to speak. We talked about mild stress previously and how it can be a good thing. And remember, in rats, it can lead to neuronal growth. But perhaps even in educational settings, Carol Dweck, a psychologist, has stated that youth attribute academic failures to inescapable conditions. We often tell ourselves that we are bad at math or not smart, or that we have a bad memory due to these past experiences. So we have this mindset when we encounter other problems, we do not even try. But Carol Dweck believes that maybe, like Seligman's assertion, if problems can be overcome early or before, then that will lead one to overcome other problems in the future that might be more challenging. But what might this look like? This might include giving children problems that they can overcome, easy problems to begin with, and then teaching them to escape failure by exposing the child to more challenging problems that he or she can master. You start easy and then increase in difficulty. Carol Dweck took part in a landmark study where she took 100 7th graders that were struggling in math. She randomly assigned them into two groups. One group was taught proper study habits, while the others were taught about neuroplasticity, how the brain can change, and how the brain can develop like a muscle. They taught them that every time they learned something new, their brain was forming and the connections became stronger, and that the brain is plastic and can form, map, and rewire. The other group were just taught study habits. Now you would think that the group that were taught proper study habits would be the group that outperforms the other group that were just taught about brain plasticity. But it wasn't so. At the end of the 8-week session, those who were taught about the brain, its plasticity, and how it can change exceeded the test scores of the group that was taught proper study habits. That shows us how important it might be to seeing ourselves able to learn and our brain can change. And perhaps there is something to our mindset. Just a note on this study though. It has been repeated by other researchers, and there seems to be some different results depending on the demographics. For example, older adults, when part of the study like this, do not seem to progress as much. Kelly McGonigal, a psychologist, talks about this in her TED Talk and brings up a study from Harvard. She talks about mindsets and an attitude to have when dealing with stress. She talks about viewing stress as a beneficial thing instead of always dangerous. The study she mentions in Harvard found that individuals that saw stress for what it is, instead of something that we are often told about that will kill us, see it perhaps as something that can enhance our abilities, actually decreased their physiological responses to stress. This is huge and is found in her TED Talk here. The truth is, as we talked about, that a little bit of stress may actually make us perform better, and viewing stress this way may increase performance. It's a great TED Talk, so I recommend you watching this.